The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty hills of Nevada Territory, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape where Sarah McKenna had spent most of her 22 years. The daughter of Jack McKenna, the most respected hunter in 3 counties, she moved through the wilderness with the silent grace her father had taught her since childhood. Her weathered leather boots barely disturbed the dry earth as she tracked the faint prints of a wounded deer through the scrubland. Sarah paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her rifle resting comfortably in the crook of her arm. The wind carried the familiar scents of sagebrush and dust, but something else lingered in the air, something that made her heart quicken with unease. In the distance, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the canyon, came a sound that didn't belong in this desolate place, the desperate crying of a child. Her father had always told her, "In the desert, Sarah, you listen with more than your ears. You listen with your soul." Now, as that heartbreaking wail echoed off the canyon walls, she felt her soul pulling her toward something that would change everything. Following the sound, Sarah navigated through a maze of red rocks and dried creek beds, the child's cries growing stronger with each step. Her heart pounded not from exertion, but from a growing dread of what she might find. In these parts, a child alone meant only tragedy. Apache raids, outlaw attacks, or families torn apart by the harsh realities of frontier life. After 20 minutes of careful tracking, Sarah crested a small ridge and looked down into a shallow depression where an old creek bed curved through the landscape. There, huddled against a cluster of rocks near what had once been flowing water, sat a small figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The child couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with matted dark hair and clothes torn from travel and fear. Blood stained a makeshift bandage around the little one's arm, and tear-streaked cheeks told a story of abandonment and terror. When their eyes met, the child's crying intensified, but something in those wide, frightened eyes seemed to recognize that salvation had arrived. "Hey there, little one," Sarah called softly, setting her rifle aside and raising her hands to show she meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. What's your name?" The child, a boy she could see now, tried to shrink further into the rocks, his small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Sarah approached slowly, the way her father had taught her to approach wounded animals, with patience, gentleness, and absolute calm. "My name is Sarah," she continued, kneeling a few feet away from the boy. "I live not far from here with my papa. Are you hurt? Are you hungry?" At the mention of food, the boy's crying subsided slightly, and he looked at her with desperate hope. Sarah reached into her pack and pulled out some dried beef and her water canteen, holding them out as an offering. "Where are your mama and papa?" she asked gently, as the boy tentatively reached for the food. "Gone," came the whispered reply, the first word he'd spoken. "Bad men came. Mama said run. Don't stop running." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what bad men meant in this territory. The Garrett gang had been terrorizing settlements for months, leaving destruction and heartbreak in their wake. If this child had escaped from one of their attacks, it meant his family was likely dead, and the outlaws might still be in the area. As the boy drank greedily from her canteen, Sarah made a decision that she knew would alter the course of her life forever. She couldn't leave him here to die, but taking him back to town would mean facing questions she wasn't prepared to answer. More importantly, if the Garrett gang was still hunting for survivors, bringing the boy into the open might put everyone in danger. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy," he replied, looking up at her with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "Are you gonna leave me too?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. In that moment, looking at this brave little boy who had somehow survived unimaginable horror, she felt something awaken inside her, a fierce protectiveness she'd never experienced before. "No, Tommy," she said firmly, extending her hand toward him. "I'm never going to leave you. You're safe now." As Tommy's small, dirty hand slipped into hers, Sarah felt the weight of her promise settle on her shoulders. She had no idea how she would explain this to her father, to the townspeople, or to the sheriff, who would undoubtedly want to question the boy about what he'd witnessed. All she knew was that this child needed her, and she would do whatever it took to protect him. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah lifted Tommy into her arms, surprised by how light he felt, and began the journey back toward town. With each step, she could feel her old life falling away behind her, replaced by something unknown, but undeniably important. "Are we going home?" Tommy asked quietly, his head resting against her shoulder. Sarah looked ahead toward the distant lights of Cedar Ridge, knowing that whatever awaited them, they would test everything she believed about herself, her community, and what it truly meant to be brave. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going home." The oil lamps of Cedar Ridge flickered like fallen stars against the purple twilight as Sarah approached the outskirts of town, with Tommy sleeping fitfully in her arms. The boy had exhausted himself with crying and fear, finally succumbing to sleep about a mile back, but even in rest, his small body remained tense, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Sarah's own body ached from carrying him, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the turmoil in her mind. How could she explain finding a child in the desert without revealing the full truth about the Garrett gang's latest atrocity? The people of Cedar Ridge were already on edge from recent outlaw activity, and news of another massacre would send the town into panic. The McKenna house sat at the end of Main Street, a modest but sturdy structure that Jack had built with his own hands 15 years ago. Warm light glowed in the windows, and Sarah could see her father's silhouette moving about inside, probably preparing dinner and wondering where she'd gone. Jack McKenna was a man of routine, and Sarah's late return would not go unnoticed or unquestioned. She paused at their front gate, Tommy's weight seeming to increase with each second of hesitation. There was no way to ease into this revelation. Her father would take one look at the boy and know immediately that something terrible had happened. Jack McKenna had seen enough violence in his 53 years to recognize its aftermath in a child's haunted eyes. The front door opened before Sarah could reach for the handle, and her father stepped out onto the porch. Jack McKenna was a tall, weathered man whose grey beard couldn't hide the kindness in his dark eyes. Those eyes now widened as they took in the scene before him, his daughter holding a sleeping child, both of them dusty and worn from a hard journey. "Sarah." His voice carried a mixture of concern and confusion. "What in the Lord's name?" "Papa, please," Sarah interrupted softly, mindful of the sleeping boy in her arms. "Let me get him inside first. Then I'll explain everything." Jack stepped aside without another word, his experienced gaze already assessing the child's condition. As they moved into the warmth of their simple home, Tommy stirred slightly but didn't wake. Sarah settled him gently on the worn sofa, covering him with one of her mother's quilts that still carried the faint scent of lavender. "He's hurt," she whispered to her father, pointing to the blood-stained bandage on Tommy's arm, "and he's been alone in the desert for at least 2 days, maybe more." Jack knelt beside the couch, his hunter's instincts taking over as he examined the boy without waking him. The wound was clean, but needed proper attention, and the child showed clear signs of dehydration and exhaustion. More troubling were the defensive scratches on his hands and arms, evidence of someone who had fought to escape something terrible. "Garrett gang?" Jack asked quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "He said bad men came, told his mama he'd run and not stop running." Jack's jaw clenched, and Sarah saw the familiar fire ignite in her father's eyes, the same look he got when tracking down wolves that threatened the local livestock. But this time, the wolves walked on 2 legs and carried guns. "We need to get Doc Henderson," Jack said, rising from his crouch. "And then we need to decide what we're going to do about this." "Nah, what do you mean, what we're going to do?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the complications they faced. "We're going to take care of him." "Sarah, darling, it's not that simple." Jack moved to the window and peered out at the street, checking for any signs that they'd been observed. "This boy is a witness to a massacre. The minute Sheriff Hawkins finds out about him, Tommy becomes a target. The Garrett gang doesn't leave loose ends." The reality of the situation hit Sarah like a cold wind. In her determination to save Tommy, she hadn't fully considered the danger she might be bringing to her father, to their home, to their quiet life in Cedar Ridge. But looking at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable beneath her mother's quilt, she felt her resolve strengthen rather than waver. "Then we don't tell Sheriff Hawkins," she said firmly. "Not yet." Jack turned from the window, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Sarah McKenna, are you suggesting we harbor a witness to murder without informing the law?" "I'm suggesting we protect a child who's already lost everything," Sarah shot back, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced nervously at Tommy. "Papa, look at him. He's 4 years old. He's terrified, injured, and alone. What kind of people would we be if we threw him to the wolves just because it's convenient? And what kind of people would we be if our protection gets him killed?" Jack countered, but Sarah could hear the conflict in his voice. He was a man who had always stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Before Sarah could respond, a soft voice interrupted them from the couch. "Are you gonna send me away?" Both adults turned to see Tommy sitting up, his wide eyes fixed on them, with the heartbreaking wisdom of a child who had learned too early that adults couldn't always be trusted. The quilt had fallen away, revealing the full extent of his ordeal: torn clothes, bruised skin, and hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and fear. Sarah moved to him immediately, sitting on the edge of the couch and pulling him gently against her side. "No, sweetheart, no one is sending you anywhere. But the bad men," Tommy started, his voice breaking. "The bad men can't hurt you here," Sarah said with a conviction that surprised even her. She looked up at her father, silently challenging him to contradict her. "This is your home now. You're safe." Jack McKenna stood in the lamplight, looking at his daughter and the boy she had claimed as her own, and Sarah saw the exact moment when his protective instincts overrode his practical concerns. He had raised Sarah to be strong, compassionate, and brave, qualities that were now driving her to risk everything for a child who had no one else. "Well then," Jack said quietly, moving toward them, "I guess we'd better get you properly cleaned up and fed, hadn't we, son?" Tommy looked between Sarah and Jack with cautious hope, as if afraid to believe that these strangers would truly protect him. But when Jack knelt down and gently examined the bandage on his arm with the careful touch of a man accustomed to treating wounded animals, some of the tension left the boy's small shoulders. "This needs fresh dressing," Jack murmured. "Sarah, get my medical kit. We'll tend to this properly, then figure out our next steps." As Sarah moved to retrieve her father's supplies, she caught Jack's eye and saw her own determination reflected there. They were in this together now, bound by the simple but profound decision to choose compassion over caution, love over law. Outside, the night settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy blanket, and somewhere in the darkness, dangerous men continued their reign of terror. But inside the McKenna home, a new family was being born, forged not by blood, but by the unbreakable bonds of protection, sacrifice, and hope. Tommy's journey to safety was far from over, but for the first time since his world had been destroyed, he was no longer alone. 3 weeks had passed since Tommy's arrival, and the rhythms of the McKenna household had shifted to accommodate their newest member. The boy's physical wounds were healing well under Jack's careful attention, but the emotional scars ran deeper. He still woke screaming most nights, calling for his mother, and he refused to venture outside unless Sarah was holding his hand. Sarah had thrown herself into caring for Tommy with a devotion that surprised everyone, including herself. She taught him to help with simple chores, read to him from her mother's old books, and slowly, patiently, helped him find his smile again. But the weight of their secret grew heavier with each passing day. The town was buzzing with rumors about increased outlaw activity. 3 more homesteads had been attacked in the past 2 weeks, and Sheriff Hawkins was under pressure to form a posse and hunt down the Garrett gang. Sarah watched her neighbor's fear grow, knowing that Tommy held information that could help bring the killers to justice, yet unable to risk exposing him to danger. On a crisp October morning, Sarah was in the kitchen teaching Tommy to make biscuits when a sharp knock echoed through the house. Jack had gone into town for supplies, leaving Sarah and Tommy alone, a situation that now filled her with anxiety whenever strangers came calling. "Stay here, sweetheart," Sarah whispered to Tommy, who immediately moved to hide behind the kitchen table. "Don't come out unless I call for you." Sarah opened the door to find Sheriff Hawkins standing on her porch, his weathered face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him stood a woman Sarah didn't recognize, well-dressed, but with the hard look of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelties. "Miss McKenna," Sheriff Hawkins tipped his hat respectfully, "I'm sorry to bother you, but this is Mrs. Catherine Morrison from the Territorial Office in Carson City. She's been investigating the recent attacks, and she has some questions that might help us catch these outlaws." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Of course, Sheriff. Please, come in." As they settled in the modest sitting room, Mrs. Morrison's sharp eyes took in every detail of the house. Sarah noticed how the woman's gaze lingered on small things, the extra cup on the kitchen table, visible through the doorway, the child-sized boots by the door that Jack had carved for Tommy. "Miss McKenna," Mrs. Morrison began, her voice crisp and businesslike, "we have reason to believe that someone from the Garrett gang's latest attack may have escaped. A child, specifically. We're visiting all the homesteads in the area to see if anyone has seen or heard anything unusual." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "A child? That's terrible. Where did this attack happen?" "About 15 miles northeast of here, near Willow Creek," Sheriff Hawkins replied. "The Henderson family, parents and 2 older children killed, but their youngest boy, Thomas, is missing. We found tracks leading away from the scene, but they disappeared in the rocks." Tommy's full name was Thomas. Sarah struggled to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced. These people weren't just investigating randomly. They were specifically looking for Tommy. "We believe the boy may have witnessed the murders," Mrs. Morrison continued, watching Sarah's face carefully. "He would be about 4 years old, dark hair, likely injured and traumatized. If he's still alive, he's our only hope of identifying the killers and bringing them to justice." From the kitchen came a small, almost inaudible sound, the scrape of a chair leg against the floor. Sarah's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to cough loudly to mask the noise. "I'm sorry," she said, standing quickly. "Would you like some coffee? I have a pot on the stove." "That would be lovely," Mrs. Morrison said, but her eyes were now fixed on the kitchen doorway. Sarah moved toward the kitchen, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the others could hear it. As she passed the table where Tommy was hiding, she saw his small face peering around the table leg, his eyes wide with terror. He had heard everything, the description, his real name, the talk of his murdered family. "It's okay," she mouthed silently to him. But Tommy was already backing toward the door that led to the root cellar, his small body shaking with the need to run. "Miss McKenna?" Mrs. Morrison's voice came from directly behind her. Sarah spun around to find the woman standing in the kitchen doorway, her gaze taking in the flour-dusted workspace, the child-sized handprints on the table, and the small wooden cup that Jack had carved. "You seem to have a helper in the kitchen," Mrs. Morrison observed with deceptive casualness. I sometimes help the neighbor children learn to cook," Sarah replied, hating how weak her voice sounded. "Their mothers appreciate the help." "Of course." Mrs. Morrison's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Which neighbor children, specifically?" Before Sarah could answer, Sheriff Hawkins appeared behind Mrs. Morrison, his expression troubled. "Sarah, I hate to ask this, but Mrs. Morrison has authority to search any property if she suspects we might find evidence. I know your father would understand. We're all trying to catch these killers." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. In moments, they would find Tommy, and her choice would be made for her. But as she looked at Mrs. Morrison's cold, calculating expression, a terrible thought occurred to her. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said slowly, "you mentioned that you work for the territorial office. Might I see some identification? My father always taught me to be careful about strangers." Mrs. Morrison's expression flickered, just for an instant, but it was enough. Sarah saw surprise, annoyance, and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "Of course," the woman replied, reaching into her coat, but instead of papers, her hand emerged holding a small Derringer pistol, pointed directly at Sarah's chest. Sheriff Hawkins started to react, but Mrs. Morrison was faster. "I wouldn't, Sheriff. My associates outside have rifles trained on your windows." "Jesus Christ," Hawkins breathed, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "You're with them, the Garrett gang." "Very good, Sheriff," Mrs. Morrison said mockingly, "though I prefer to think of myself as more of a clean-up specialist. See, my employers are very thorough. When we heard there might be a witness to our recent work, we decided to handle the situation personally." Sarah's mind reeled. This woman wasn't here to rescue Tommy. She was here to kill him. And now, Sarah and Sheriff Hawkins were witnesses too. "Where is the boy?" Mrs. Morrison demanded, all pretense of civility gone. "We know he's here. We've been watching this house for days." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said. But even as the words left her mouth, she heard the soft creak of the root cellar door opening behind her. Tommy emerged from his hiding place, no longer the terrified child who had been cowering moments before. His small face was set with a determination that was heartbreaking in someone so young. "Don't hurt Sarah," he said in a voice that barely carried across the room. "She saved me. Don't hurt her because of me." Mrs. Morrison's gun swung toward Tommy, but Sarah threw herself between them without thinking. "No!" The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the small kitchen. Sarah felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the kitchen table. Through the haze of pain and shock, she heard Tommy screaming her name and Sheriff Hawkins shouting as he finally drew his weapon. More gunshots erupted from outside as Hawkins and Mrs. Morrison's associates exchanged fire. Sarah tried to get to Tommy, but her left arm wouldn't work properly, and blood was soaking through her dress at an alarming rate. "Run, Tommy!" she gasped. "The back door! Run to town!" But Tommy didn't run. Instead, he grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, the same one Sarah had been teaching him to cook with, and brought it down on Mrs. Morrison's gun hand with all the strength his small body could muster. The woman screamed and dropped the Derringer, clutching her shattered fingers. Sheriff Hawkins was on her in seconds, wrestling her to the ground while the gunfire outside gradually ceased. "Sarah! Sarah, are you okay?" Tommy was beside her now, his small hands trying to stop the bleeding from her shoulder, tears streaming down his face. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Sarah lied, pulling him close with her good arm. "You're so brave. So brave." As Sheriff Hawkins secured Mrs. Morrison with rope from Jack's hunting supplies, Sarah realized that their secret was finally out. Tommy was no longer hidden, no longer protected by anonymity. But somehow that didn't feel like defeat. The boy in her arms had chosen to stand and fight rather than run and hide. He had risked his own life to save hers, just as she had risked everything to save his 3 weeks ago. In that moment, Sarah understood that protection wasn't about hiding from danger. It was about facing it together, as a family. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jack running up the road from town, having heard the gunshots. Behind him came Doc Henderson and several other townspeople, all drawn by the sound of trouble at the McKenna place. "Are we in trouble?" Tommy whispered against her good shoulder. Sarah looked at the boy who had become her son in every way that mattered, and felt a fierce pride swell in her chest alongside the pain from her wound. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "We're home." As Jack burst through the front door, his eyes taking in the scene of destruction and love before him, Sarah knew that their lives would never be simple again. The Garrett gang would pay for their crimes, Tommy would have to testify about things no child should remember, and the whole territory would know the story of the hunter's daughter who found a crying child in the desert. But they would face it all together, Sarah, Jack and Tommy, bound by the unbreakable truth that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to love someone enough to risk everything for them. In the harsh landscape of the Old West, where survival often meant thinking only of yourself, the McKenna family had discovered something more valuable than gold or land. They had found each other. And that, Sarah knew, was worth any price they would have to pay.